Welcome back to the 237th episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including how religious freedoms could actually curb forced DEI trainings in certain corporations, how the Social Security myths that have been going around may not actually be 100% true. I mean, kind of inferred by the name myth. And then, of course, our final article will be about the Fed Chair Jerome Powell and his money tightening policies that could ruin the election for Mr. Joe Biden. And, of course, we will end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive and ready to take on the day. Now, that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. So, if a certain training that your corporation is going to require you to do, are you forced to do it even if it violates some of your religious freedoms? I think it's a very interesting sort of idea. Now, I always go back and forth because if it's something that you know you have to do, if they tell you ahead of time, hey, when you get this job, you're going to have to do this particular training, and it's something that you really have a conviction about, you are more than likely going to, at least hesitate, and I think you should say no to the job. And I don't think that an employer can necessarily be held liable for having these trainings unless they don't tell their employees about it. If it is in the contract, or at least it's talked about orally and said, hey, we have these particular trainings that you will have to do when you get onboarded, or you'll have to do them on a yearly basis, then you are voluntarily going into that interaction. You're voluntarily going into that contract knowing that this is something that you'll have to do, and therefore you can't claim, oh, well, it violates my religious freedom. Now, if it's something that's not talked about and then you're forced to go to it, I think that is a different situation. You weren't willingly accepting those terms when you go into this sort of contract. Then again, I think that this article, this first one that we're going to go into, has some interesting talking points, and it has a more broad point that it goes beyond just these DEI trainings. So let's jump into that. But if you have any sort of comments, if you agree, disagree, throw them down in the comment section. I'd love to hear what everybody has to say. All right, so the first one, it comes from the Daily Signal, and like I read earlier, forced DEI training may violate religious freedom, lawyer says. Now, this is obviously a very contentious article, or at least the premise is pretty contentious. A lot of DEI trainings have been forced among lots of different corporate entities, even on the government level, certain contractors. Anyone who contracts with the government at one point had to have a time and place that they did one of these DEI trainings. So this is something that it's kind of fallen to the wayside. It's not necessarily something that is talked about as much, mainly because a lot of corporations are realizing, hey, it's not actually beneficial. But now, for the ones that still pursue it, there could be an out for the people in that organization that feel as though this is not something that they want to participate in, that it violates their beliefs, so on and so forth. I'll read the first two paragraphs for you. Quote, Nashville, Tennessee, Christian employees can raise religious freedom complaints against mandated diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings if those DEI trainings force an ideology on them or make them less able to live out their faith, a prominent religious liberty lawyer says. And this was during one of the Daily Signal podcasts. Quote, there's a lot of push for diversity initiatives and things like that, where you've got to go through these trainings. Jeremy Dyes, a special counsel for the litigation and communications at the religious freedom law firm First Liberty, says in an interview at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, quote, well, a lot of people have genuine religious beliefs that oppose being indoctrinated under those topics, end quote. So this is another thing that came up, or at least religious freedom came up previously in a case where a gentleman who was working for the post office, and the article brings this up as well, and that's why I was reminded of it, and he said that, hey, you can't force me to work on Sunday because I have to observe the Sabbath. And this is one of those cases where I don't know if as a general rule, this is something that is okay, or if it's something that once again comes down to, did you agree to work on Sundays before in the contract? Did you have an explicit clause in there saying, hey, I will not work Sundays? And you may be saying, well, Alex, hey, you can't be forced to do anything against your religion. Well, actually, I think when we talk about the First Amendment, a lot of people forget that companies actually can make you not say things. They can limit your free speech, or else you will be fired, because it is not actually the government mandating a certain type of speech on you. It is not the government mandating a type of religion on you. And the reason that I think that is very important is because these private corporations, if a private corporation signs a contract with somebody, and then that contract entails certain things, but then later on the person says, oh, okay, I've converted to Christianity, and now this is a tenet of my life that I do not want violated. I need the Sabbath. What do they have an obligation to first? That company has an obligation to enforce the contract. And if we're going to make exceptions for the contract based on this faith, rather than just renegotiating, but somehow it gets to the lawsuit sphere, it gets to the place where it's actually in front of the court instead of being civil and actually having a negotiation and saying, okay, hey, Jimmy, we understand that you've changed your life practices. We won't make you work on Sunday. But no, I don't think that the Supreme Court or any court should be jumping in and saying, hey, yes, you can violate the contract in order to protect this one person's First Amendment right, because that First Amendment right doesn't necessarily apply to private contracts. It applies to the interaction between that individual and the government. And my point is not that, oh, yes, no, we need to curtail religious freedoms. No, if you want to have any religious belief that you want, and it mandates that your Saturday, if you're Jewish, Orthodox Jewish, and or some people in the Christian faith also observe a Saturday Sabbath, and they don't use any technology during that time, or at least they put down certain types of technology. They're not going to be answering their emails. You should have a right to do that, but you should also have to inform your employer that, hey, okay, I'm not going to be doing this during this time. This is going to be one of the contingencies of my contract with you. This is going to be one of the contingencies of my job. And if I can't have it, then I'm sorry, I'm going to have to say I'm not going to work for you. And hopefully you have enough pull so that you can actually negotiate that into the contract. The reason I think this is very important is because I do not want the religious liberties argument to overcome the contract system that undergirds all of our freedoms within this country. And you may be saying, Alex, you're just taking it too far. But where does it start then? Maybe somebody starts a religion that says they don't have to obey anybody but their inner soul, and God speaks to them through their inner soul, and it becomes a recognized religion somehow, and then they actually can just violate every contract because it is I know, we're taking it to its absolute end, but this is where we go. We need, in order to have a society, we need to have a legal system that respects private property and the contracts that people sign, and enforce those contracts between the parties. That is one of the undergirding most important parts of our society. All the other freedoms, religious freedom, freedom of speech, all these sort of things, an open and fair press, a unrigged trial, unjust punishment, all of these things are setting boundaries. They're setting rules between you and the government, not between you and another private individual. So, I mean, I guess technically, in some cases, it blurs that line when you're in like a public space. But when it comes to private contracts, it is not determining, okay, yes, no, even in a contract, you have the right to say absolutely everything you want. Then why would we have any sort of agreement such as a NDA or a non-disclosure agreement? That would obviously violate the First Amendment. No, you should be able to say whatever you want. No, okay, remember, these protections are between the citizen and the government. So I don't think that it can actually extend to the point where your religious freedoms can overcome any sort of contract that is written out. And like I said, this is why it's really important in this case, because if it is told to you beforehand that there are mandatory DEI trainings and it is somewhere in that contract, then okay, guess what? You got to deal with it. You sign the contract, you can leave, or you can try to fight it and say that they're illegal in another way, but religious freedom isn't the way to go about it. Now, if you take the job and then it is not mentioned within the contract, and it said, hey, you have to do this in order to keep your job. And there's not any clause in there that says you will be forced or you will be asked to go to mandatory trainings of a variety of a type, blah, 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 blah. Then if it's not put in there any which way, and they're just trying to mandate that you do these trainings, they just throw it onto your Outlook schedule one day, then yeah, I think you could base your argument on that. And even then, I think there could be more intricate ones, which is, no, you can't just force me to do these sort of things because I don't actually agree with them, or you can't just force me to do these sort of things. These weren't within the original purview of our contract. If I had known that you would make me do this beforehand, I wouldn't have signed the contract, so on and so forth. It's like adding in an extra little clause in the contract towards the end, even though it wasn't formally signed by either party. So I think you could use other means to actually get to the same end. But it's very interesting where this religious lawyer takes this and where he's basing it off of. So I want to jump to one of the paragraphs a little bit further down. Quote, now it requires everybody from the boardroom to the mailroom to work together to accommodate the faith of the employees in question, Dies explains. So no longer is it like, well, look, the job is more important than your religious beliefs. Do the job or get out. Now it is, quote, we recognize that your religious beliefs are at least as important to you as your job. I think actually more important. Let's sit down and figure out how we can accommodate your religious beliefs so that you're a good employee here as well. And guess what? I agree with that. And I think that it's just common decency. And I can understand where this lawyer or other religious advocates are coming from, which is some people just don't have that common decency. If they don't share that common belief system, then it's going to be very, very difficult to have these sort of conversations. So having it protected under law would make it so that, yeah, you're forcing employers to do it. But also, guess what happens? Employers are going to say, oh, wait, hold on, I'm going to have to put a special addendum in there. I'm not going to be able to call on Jimmy Joe or Billy Phi or Max Wilson, whatever their random names are. I'm not going to be able to call on them on Sunday. Well, hey, that's a strategic disadvantage. I need someone who can just randomly pick up the phone on Sunday, so I'm just going to go for all the atheists out there. So you could see how this could possibly change the dynamics. If it is just presumed that you are discriminating against somebody because of their religion if you ask them to do something on Sunday, and it's directly protected like this, guess what? People are just going to not try to hire Christians because it's a disadvantage. They're not going to answer their emails an entire day. Sometimes you can't have that. Sometimes employers are going to look at that and say, hey, I need this response right now. And you could argue that maybe that is discrimination. I think there would be an interesting case there. But you could also see the rationale of the employer, which is, I need this done now. He's a really good data analyst, but he's completely off the charts, completely gone. I can't even text him something to be ready for Monday on those days because it's seen as invading a sacred day, which is the Sabbath. Then yeah, you can see why employers would be frustrated with that. Then again, I also think that you really should be able to say, no, hey, this is my day off. I like the idea of a Saturday Sabbath or a Sunday Sabbath with no technology. I absolutely love that idea. I find that it's really hard to actually do nowadays in the world where we're constantly getting emails, notifications are coming over our phone. Some places don't take cash whatsoever. So if you don't have your cards on, you can't just tap your phone because you're doing a day without it. But I like the idea of disconnecting like that for an entire day. It's really important. I think that I'm going to at least test it out with my family when I get a little bit older, and if that's based in religious beliefs, if it's not based in religious beliefs, I think that honestly it's based in religious beliefs. Otherwise, I don't know why. Maybe the justification is, hey, you just disconnect for a little bit, but I think that basing it in religious beliefs actually gives people a stronger motivation as well. They see it as not just doing it for themselves, but doing it for the community and the people around them and for God and so on and so forth. So I think all of those things are important, but I also do believe that at the end of the day, you need to lay this out at the very beginning and say, hey, okay, I want to come work for you. I really do. Just know ahead of time that my Sundays are off limits. Know your value. And if you are valuable enough where you're in that negotiating position and you can say that, then great, do it. Or what you do is you come in and you say, hey, I would love to have my Sundays off. Say, hey, we can't do that. Then as you work your way up in the company, you say, okay, hey, I'm at a position now where I could get a little bit of a salary boost. That's great. Could I also, when I get a little bit less of a salary boost, but could I have my Sundays off guaranteed and use that leverage that you have in order to get there? I know not everybody has that opportunity, but in an ideal world where people know their value, or at least have some idea of their value, and employers also want to keep that value and retain that value, that would be the way to go about it, rather than making it something that goes through the courts, and the courts mandate that employers do this, that, or other in order to change the nature of the way that they do contracts. Then again, there have been many precedents in the past where you can't have certain clauses in contracts before, so maybe I am just a little bit crazy on this one. I would just prefer that we keep the government out of it if we could, but that is just me. All right, so let's jump to our second article that comes from The Dispatch, and this one is 10 Myths Sabotaging Social Security Reform. And I honestly had to go back and see if I had looked through this one before, because at the end of the day, I remember reading it and I was like, oh, this would be a really interesting one to talk about, especially as we're heading towards a government shutdown. And sometimes Republicans say, hey, this is something we could put on the table as a way as a leverage point, because we know that maybe some Democrats want to get this government shutdown off the table. So, hey, we have a little bit of leverage here. Let's apply it. But then I never actually did an article on it. I had to go back and check. So I wanted to run through these very quickly because this is also a pre-recorded episode. So let's see what the first myth is. Social Security cannot run deficits. I'm just going to read the quote here. This is not true. In 2024, Social Security will collect $1.308 trillion in payroll taxes and related revenues and spend $1.459 trillion in benefits, resulting in a $151 billion shortfall. And you're going to be like, wait, hold on. Okay, so you're telling me that my payroll taxes aren't going directly towards the people that are taking out Social Security, because what? I mean, we're obviously pulling from somewhere else. This is part of the endowment that when the Social Security did actually run surpluses, when there were more people paying into Social Security than taking out, we actually put it into a trust fund. But now that trust fund is going to run out, and as the older population maintains its size, or at least in proportion to the lower population, which is slowly decreasing, then we're going to keep running these sort of shortfalls, and it's going to keep running deficits. Eventually, we will run past the point where that trust fund actually has money, and then we're going to have to cut benefits to those older people in the population. Social Security insolvency is a fictional scare tactic, quote unquote. Quote, current law mandates that when the trust fund balance hits zero, which is when $3 trillion in earlier surpluses has been repaid, the system will legally forbid from borrowing or receiving any more general revenues. Program spending then must fall to match the system's revenues. So basically the way that it's structured is that once the surplus is gone, they can't just, say we're going to borrow more money in order to pay this off, which let's be clear, they could very well change it if they wanted to. They could pass a new law, but it will be politically popular exactly when we hit that moment, but it'll also be unpopular with the spending hawks and people saying, hey, no, we can't just keep spending more money on this because it's just going to get more exorbitantly large as our youth population starts to shrink more and more and more, even though we may start having a little bit more immigration in order to balance it out. Still, with the demographic decline that we're going to have here in America and across the West in general, but specifically since this is an American program, Social Security here in America, it's going to make things very difficult. And the way that the program is structured is you can't just take out more money. You have to actually cut benefits in order for things to level out. You can't just say, hey, okay, we have an extra $150 billion that we need to make up for. We can just borrow that against ourselves. We can put out some more bonds that the U.S. stock market could buy, or maybe some lenders in China, things like that. So that's a pretty interesting myth, because I hear it a lot when I've talked with people. Either they say, hey, it won't be around when we're old enough, so why should I care about it? Which I'm like, that's great. That's a really good point. You think it won't be around. How about we just kill it now rather than it going up in a ball in flames, and we actually reserve the rest of the leftovers for the people that have already paid into it over like 30. And anyone under 30, I'm sorry, You've paid into it for a while, but not that long, and you still have enough time to really start structuring your own retirement account as well. Yeah, I know. I'm fortunate. I've already opened a Roth IRA. So now let's be clear. Have I done all the perfect asset allocation? No, I'm an ignorant investor. I know what I like. I know what I would want to invest in, but does that mean that it's ideal? No. And then you're giving up the security of just a guaranteed check from the government. That is 100% fair, but maybe putting the responsibility on people will make them actually be more prudent with the way that they spend their money now. I mean, maybe actually putting responsibility on people's shoulders doesn't cause them to crumble, or at least if they start to stumble, normally they tend to get up and they try to actually rise to the occasion. Not everybody can, but I've noticed this from a lot of people. The more responsibility you put on them, the better they can actually do. The trust fund is real and was rated by Congress. That myth was a political talking point. I don't even feel like it's worth the time to go into that one. The insolvency can wait to be addressed. I feel like that's a stupid one as well. Seniors get back only what they paid in. This one was actually very interesting, and it's not actually true. Quote, today, the typical mid-income retired couple will have paid just $783,000 into Social Security and will receive roughly $831,000 in benefits, all adjusted into net present value, so adjusted for inflation. Low-income individuals and one-earner couples often come out far ahead with respect to their lifetime payroll taxes. I mean, that's a really interesting one there. That's a good point. There is a little bit of extra benefit, which is, hey, you sacrifice this for most of your working career, and you actually get a little bit of extra juice. You get a little bit of extra money out of it. So I think at the end of the day, that's one idea as to why the system is actually appealing, because, hey, you've paid into it, and now you're getting a little bit of extra juice out of it, so to speak, like I mentioned. But yes, it is a common myth that, okay, hey, this money that was put in by Angela, since she didn't work for that 1 year, she actually worked for all these years from 20 to 30, and then she took a break for her kids, and then she came back at 35, and then they do some nice little calculation where they're like, okay, so we're going to exclude 5 years. No, it's just basically level set Social Security for practically everybody. Which is an interesting way to go about it. There could be some free riders because of it, which is some of the complaints that people have about the Social Security system. And there's one more that I really, really like, because it is so cute, and it's mentioned to me a lot when I talk to people about this. Just a few tweaks can save Social Security. Just a few tweaks. What do you mean? Oh, just a few tweaks to make it so that it doesn't go insolvent for another extra 20 years. I mean, hey, we're pushing it off another 20 years, but does that actually solve the system? Quote, from 2023 to 2053, Social Security is projected to collect $69 trillion in payroll benefit taxes, while spending $92 trillion on benefits plus $15 trillion in interest costs resulting from those shortfalls. While Social Security reform is relatively straightforward, its three reform levers are benefits, payroll taxes, and eligibility age. Closing a $23 trillion shortfall will require significant reform that reforms that revolve each levers. So you can't just say, okay, hey, we're going to limit benefits a little bit more and then we're good. Or you can't just say, hey, we're going to raise payroll taxes and we're good. Or we're just going to have to actually raise the eligibility age and hey, we're fine. You're going to have to do a little bit of tinkering with all three. And the tricky one, and the reason that's important is because you could get away with saying, hey, there's a little bit less benefits. You could say that because people that are on the system, even if they're close, but a lot of people that are on the system won't have to deal with that until it's far off. So they're looking at the thing they're losing and they're not necessarily fully appreciating it because it is further away. So they have time to forget about that loss, so to speak, or at least not be emotionally attached to it. And then the eligibility age, unless you're right there at retirement, a lot of people, once again, it's far off. They're not necessarily really thinking about it. They don't understand the full repercussions because it's right then and there. The one that people are always frustrated with, and it is always hard to get past them, is payroll taxes, because that affects them immediately. They see the tax rates go up, and that is something that is not politically advantageous. And that's why I wanted to bring that one up specifically, because that will always be the issue you have when trying to address Social Security and make sure that there's more money in the pile for everybody. You're going to have to increase payroll taxes along with other things. And guess what? That's not that's not something people like. It's not electorally advantageous for you. Let's put it that way. But hey, speaking about money and raising rates and everything like that, you like that transition? Let's jump to our article from Business Insider, how Fed Chair Jerome Powell's big decision could impact the upcoming presidential election. And yes, I mean, we've talked about this before, how the Mr. Powell's decision-making can actually very much affect how people perceive the economy going into next year's election, and it could benefit either Trump or it could benefit Biden. Quote, for roughly a year, market watchers' top question has been when the Federal Reserve will cut interest rates. The decision, which has had massive economic implications, is now butting up against another monumental event, a U.S. presidential election. The collision course puts an incredible amount of power in Fed Chair Jerome Powell's hands. Business Insider's Emily Stewart writes, what he chooses to do with interest rates could swing the election either way. And this is very, very true. If he decides, hey, we're not fully over our inflationary spiral yet, so we're going to keep rates where they are, or even he may see in the core product inflation, the CPI, and he may say, hey, actually, it's going up a little bit. Maybe we should raise rates a little bit more. It will cause a little bit of a ruckus in the market, and then all these historic gains that have happened under Biden's presidency will go down. People won't necessarily be happy. Or he says, hey, actually, inflation is abating a little bit, and he lowers the rates, and people who have been waiting for these lower rates start buying or start getting more loans or take out more mortgages, and then we might have more spending that could keep inflation where it is or possibly raise it afterwards. There's lots of different factors here. It's not just one or the other, and he's obviously going to take all of them into account, but either one of those particular options that happen from either of the decisions look bad for Biden. Now, he could raise the rates, and the people in the market are like, oh, well, hey, yeah, we know that he was going to raise the rates. It's a temporary thing. It rebounds very quickly and people get over. They're like, oh, my stocks are back up. No big deal. And then also they could say, hey, we're going to lower the rates. And some people are still hesitant to get into the market. Some people who are a little bit more risk taker, they're like, okay, hey, housing is probably sitting at what now 6% instead of 6.5 or 6.25%. Maybe I should take out my mortgage now, but there's still going to be some people waiting for that juicy 5% interest rate when taking out a mortgage. So it may not actually affect that much, and everything may go smoothly. There are lots of different options here, but there is no doubt that if the policy happens and there's a shock in one way or another and it's not fully accounted for, it could go very, very badly for Jerome Powell in those White House meetings, because Joe Biden is going to be sitting there yelling at him saying, my approval numbers just went down. What are you doing, Jerome? But hey, we'll see how that one pans out. Keep your eye on it, because we're coming up to the day, I believe it's actually today, that he's going to announce the new interest rate changes. So if you see all of your stocks crash at some point today, maybe the market's kind of scared that he's actually going to increase the rate. And if he lowers the rate, then you are going to probably make a good chunk of change today. So let's jump to our daily delight that comes from OregonLive.com. And the headline reads, Oregon Zoo bear cubs come out to play. And what I thought was really interesting about these guys is they're not actually like brother or sister. They are actually imported from two completely different locations, and yet together they went around and frolicked no problem. Quote, the orphaned cubs, who are both males, have been at the zoo since December, after they were rescued separately in Alaska, but they spent most of their time hanging out behind the trees. The zoo says that's changing, and the cubs are venturing out to explore the habitat and play nearly every day now. And then the guy who is actually kind of watching them, he's kind of the head zookeeper for them, he says, Quote, Thorn and Thimber both like to climb trees and play chase. They are a lot of fun, and they're a lot of fun to watch. We're excited for guests to get to know them. And if you want to see any of the cute photos or any of the cute videos of these two, or you want to read any of today's articles, there'll be a link in the description below that like and subscribe button where you can find all of them. Also down there, you can find the link to the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Google Podcast, as well as Podvine. I know Google Podcast is kind of falling apart now, but if it's still up, if Google Podcast, the service is still up, then you can go over there and listen there. As well as in that description, you'll find the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip over at Twitter. And over there, I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. So with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.